Vehicle reporting.
Vehicle
Acknowledge.
reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Reporting.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Reporting. At once.
Agree.
Very well.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledge.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Very well. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction options.
Reporting.
Building.
Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Construction complete.
Affirmative.
Construction options. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Awaiting affirmative.
Construction options. Building.
Vehicle
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Reporting.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledge.
complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Vehicle.
Affirmative.
Building.
Ready and waiting. Vehicle
Acknowledge.
reporting.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. New construction options.
Vehicle. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Reporting.
Awaiting
Very
orders.
well. Awaiting orders.
Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Building. Construction complete. Cannot deploy here. Building. Construction complete.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Awaiting. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Report acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Very
Unit
well.
lost.
Yes, sir. At one.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Our
Yes,
base
sir.
is under
Acknowledge.
attack.
Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Building. Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle
Affirmative.
awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. Construction options.
Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Repairing.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit prepared.
Reporting. Vehicle.
Affirmative.
Repair.
Awaiting acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative. Waiting orders.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Reporting.
lost.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit repaired.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative.
Repair.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Wait.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit repaired.
Affirmative.
Building. Repair. Unit lost.
Vehicle affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Vehicle
Unit
acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Report affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
repaired.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Vehicle acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Report.
Repair.
Yes,
Unit
sir.
ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Our base is under attack.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. 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 Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Waiting orders.
lost.
Yes, sir. At once. Very well. Affirmative.
Unit
Sir.
lost.
At once.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
Acknowledge.
Unit
Reporting.
lost.
At once. Acknowledge.
Unable to comply.
Reporting.
Building in progress. Building. Unit lost. Reconstruction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Construction complete.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Vehicle reporting. Reporting. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Vehicle
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Our base is
Yes,
under
sir.
attack.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Low power.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Building.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Cannot deploy here. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting. Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. 10 seconds.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Insufficient
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Building.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. Unit ready. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Vehicle
Preparing.
reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit repaired.
Yes, sir.
Repairing. Unit repaired. Repairing. Unit repaired.
Yes, sir.
Repairing.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Unit
Reporting.
prepared.
Acknowledged.
Repairing.
Affirmative.
Unit prepared. Repairing.
Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledged.
Building. Unit prepared.
Vehicle affirmative. Acknowledged.
Repairing.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared. Construction complete.
Yes, affirmative. Sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Vehicle reporting.
Vehicle reporting. Reporting.
Repairing.
Affirmative.
Construction complete. Unit prepared. Primary building selected. Building. Repairing.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Repairing.
Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Building. Unit ready. Unit prepared. Building. Repairing. Construction complete. Building. Building. Unit prepared. Unit ready. Construction complete. Repairing. Building. Construction complete. Building. Unit prepared. Construction complete.
Awaiting orders. Awaiting orders.
Unit prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Repairing.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting order. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Construction complete.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting orders. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge.
Building. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Vehicle. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building. Unit ready.
Awaiting orders.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes,
Building.
sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirm. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit
Waiting orders.
lost.
Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Sir.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
One.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirm. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirm. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit ready. Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building. Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. 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 Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Waiting orders.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirm. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Yes,
lost.
sir.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Ready
Unit
and waiting.
lost.
Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir. At once.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost. Unit
Reporting.
lost.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Unit lost.
Affirm. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Wait.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Reporting. Awaiting
lost.
order. Acknowledged. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Awaiting orders.
lost.
Awaiting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledge. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Awaiting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Awaiting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Mission accomplished.